Thank you for joining us today for this webinar on community planning, hosted by the First Nations Infrastructure Institute. My name is Jason Calla, and I'm going to be your host for this session. I'm a member of the Fini technical team. I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleague John Dumbrell, another member of the Fini technical team, as well as Jason Reeves on this webinar. Today, we're going to explore some aspects of community planning and how it can improve infrastructure outcomes for First Nations and Indigenous organizations. Throughout this webinar, we will explore the following topics: understanding the land and determining community needs, identifying proposed uses on First Nation lands, considering how the proposed uses will affect the demand for services like water, for example, and thinking about the infrastructure improvements that could be built to meet this demand for services. Before we dive into this topic, though, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the First Nations Infrastructure Institute, or FINI, F-N-I-I for short. FINI was established through an amendment to the FMA in 2023, and it joins three other organizations: the First Nations Financial Management Board, the First Nations Finance Authority, and the First Nations Tax Commission. FINI's here to work with your team. Our mission is to add more tools to the FMA toolbox and to support First Nations and Indigenous organizations in the planning, procurement, development, operations, and maintenance of infrastructure projects. As our development board chair has said, FINI's designed to build on the success of the FMA model. It will be optional. There's now about 370 First Nations across Canada that are working with the FMA tools. And FINI will work with those nations and other nations and Indigenous organizations to optimize their infrastructure business case with best practices. You could think of FINI as bringing some bench strength to your team. If invited, FINI team members could join your team to advance your project. FINI would work alongside other members that could include members of your administration and your leadership, like councillors, other Indigenous organizations like tribal councils or regional Indigenous organizations like the Atlantic Water Authority, and external advisors. Inviting FINI to join your team can support project development, incorporate best practices, and build capacity, and help manage risks so that projects can be delivered on time and on budget. The FINI team has been working with First Nations and Indigenous organizations across Canada. Our conversations often come to the topic of community planning. We're fortunate to be joined today by John Dumbrell, who has a lot of experience with infrastructure plans. John, why is community planning so important when we're talking about infrastructure?
Thanks so much for the opportunity to join you this morning, Jason. And as you mentioned earlier, I am a member of the FINI technical team. So when we think about community and infrastructure planning, very important in terms of the community planning portion of it, looking at the nation's land base and planning for the activities that might occur on that land base. And then secondly, to look at the infrastructure, things like water systems and roads and sanitary sewer that are required to provide for those community uses. So I'd like to take us through an example as part of this webinar of a First Nation that has undertaken a community planning exercise as well as infrastructure. So here we see the land that's held by a First Nation. This is a hypothetical situation, but I think one that can be imagined by many nations in Canada. So here we see one of the nation's reserve lands, and as we see, it's located along a water body. And we see roads and other activities happening in the vicinity here of this reserve lands. What are some of the considerations that we take into account when planning for the land uses that are taking place within this land base that we saw just a moment ago? The first thing is to understand the land that falls within, in this example, those reserve lands. Well, what do we mean by that? Well, on that land base, we can imagine that there would be some culturally sensitive areas. There could be very well environmentally sensitive areas, for example, along the lakeshore or along other water bodies or streams that come through. We can also imagine that there would be hazard lands, for example, very steep slopes or soils that might be unstable. And then we also need to think about the tenure of the land. In many communities in Canada, we have commonly held land as well as lands that's held by individual members of the nation or certificate of possession lands. So all those considerations need to be taken into account: cultural, environmental, hazardous, tenure, and other situations to understand the land base on which activity could take place. Second, thinking about that activity that might take place, we need to determine the needs of the community. Housing, of course, is one thing that comes up so often in communities across Canada, looking for additional member housing or potentially market housing as well. The second would be community buildings. It could be a school, could be a health center, could be a recreation facility, could be a big house. Many examples there of what community buildings might occur within these reserve lands. A third area would be economic development, where a nation has chosen to use a portion of its land base for economic development activities. That could be, for example, a commercial area, an industrial park, institutional buildings. That'd be another good example of economic development on nation land. So all of those things could be considered as needs of the community that could occur on the land base. Moving on then to identifying where development of the land for various uses could occur. So here we think about that. We look at that entire land base within the reserve, take out the areas that are culturally or environmentally or otherwise sensitive, and then identify the specific locations where things like housing or economic development could occur. Moving on to then the fourth bullet here, ensuring that utilities and other infrastructure can be available to provide services. Road access would be a good example. Water systems, sanitary sewer systems, storm drainage, electricity, natural gas, if it's available in the area, would be the kind of utilities that would be available to provide for the housing, the economic development, the community buildings, and so on occurring on the land base. And then finally, and of course, very importantly, engaging the community throughout the process. Chief and council, community members, other organizations with an interest in the land base, definitely engage throughout this whole process of planning what can occur on the land. Okay, so having been through that exercise, this is a typical result of a land use planning exercise. And so I'll walk us through here the different aspects of how this nation has chosen to use a portion, this reserve within its overall land base. So first off, we'll see areas that are not colored in those various different colors shown in the legend. In other words, they're just the areas shown in green essentially here. So these would be areas where they could be the culturally sensitive areas, they could be environmentally sensitive, they could be hazardous because of the steep slopes. So these are areas where the nation has said, we're not going to touch that portion of the land base. We're not going to put any development activity on it because of those sensitivities that I just mentioned. So having taken away that portion of the land base, then we see the areas identified by the different colors that are under the land use summary. And I'll just take a moment to describe what each of those are. So in that brown color, we see the community buildings of the nation. Again, this could be the school, the administration building, the health center, and so on. Second, we see member residential in the navy blue color, and quite a large area there has been dedicated to member residences. In red, we see commercial activities. In the case of this nation, they have chosen to have a gas station, a convenience store, and a little commercial plaza associated with it, and that's the land that's shown here in red. Leasehold cottages. Again, this is an area where this nation has chosen to use a portion of their land base to lease cottages and to use the revenue coming from those leases for various community purposes. So we'll see, again, in this case here, where the nation has chosen a portion of that waterfront land and has dedicated it toward these cottages. In the green, we see a trailer park. As it happens in this nation, there's a certificate of possession landholder, and they have chosen to use their land here as a trailer park, again, shown along the foreshore of the lake. So those are the existing uses that are in place. And then as part of the planning, the community has also said, well, we want to look forward here because we do see some additional uses required in the future. One, for future member residences. We're very interested in having people move back to the community, and we've seen quite a bit of interest in that from nation members. And so the lands that are shown in that light blue color have been designated for use as member residential activities. And then finally, for future economic development, we'll see the lands in purple here, both adjacent to that commercial activity that's already in place, as well as future land along the lakeshore for future economic development activities. So that's what we see then in terms of the summary of land use, both for the developed portions of the land, shown in the colors, as well as the land that's been set aside, which is not shown with any specific color here. Okay, what about servicing that? So here now we start to think about the infrastructure and how that's integrated with the community planning. So in this case, we're using water as an example to say, what is the water infrastructure that's in place now to service the lands that we currently have building on? And then also looking forward into the future to say how we're going to service those future development areas. So I'll take us through now the components. Again, this is just of a water system for providing infrastructure to serve the lands. For the water supply, we'll see an intake that's shown by the star that's located out in the lake. So that's where the supply comes from. Because it's surface water, in order to make it potable or clean to drink, it needs to be treated. And so we see a box there, which is the treatment facility, and that needs to be upgraded in order to supply this future land that's going to be developed, as well as to provide, of course, ongoing good quality water for existing uses that are already in place. Third piece here would be the storage tank. And so during times of high water use, that could be in the summertime because of hot weather and higher demands in the summertime, or in the case of fire protection, to make sure that there's enough water stored to provide for fire suppression. We definitely need to have a water storage tank or reservoir. So that's shown here by the circle. Then we've got existing infrastructure that's already in place, shown in the darker gray line. And so when we think here about water pipes, essentially, some of them are large in diameter, and those are shown by the larger gray lines. And then off that comes the distribution system that goes to service sort of individual buildings. So the ones that are currently in place to service all the existing land uses are those that are shown in the darker gray color. Again, the dark gray thick lines for the water mains and the smaller lines for the water distribution system. But what about the extension of that into the future areas? So here we see, to service that future member residential as well as future economic development, we see in white the thick white lines that'll provide that water system upgrade to service those future uses. Okay, we've talked now quite a bit about water infrastructure and how that's linked to this planning of the land thinking into the future. But what about the other kinds of infrastructure that are required in communities? So I'll turn back here to how Finney thinks about infrastructure from two perspectives. First, what's meant by infrastructure, and then second, where Finney will be involved in supporting infrastructure development in communities. So first, what's meant by infrastructure? Mentioned a number of these things already, and they're the things that are shown in the red font on this diagram. So starting off at the bottom there, we'll see water right in the center. We'll also see stormwater, storm drainage, and so this is the facilities that are required either for rain events or for snowmelt events or for combinations of those things to make sure that water is moved away from the community and away from buildings in a safe way. Over to the left of that, we'll see transportation. So we often think of roads in terms of transportation infrastructure, but also here we should consider sidewalks and trails as other means of infrastructure for moving throughout the community. Moving over further to the right, wastewater. So this is the collection and treatment and disposal of wastewater that comes from showers and sinks and toilets within buildings to make sure that it's properly treated and disposed of in an environmentally sensitive kind of way. And then a list of other infrastructure over on the far right at the bottom there. That could be solid waste facilities, electricity, natural gas supplies, or telecommunications that provide for the needs of these buildings that are going in on the nation's lands. Okay, now I'd like to move up sort of above the surface, if you will, over to the left side, where Finney again thinks about some of the infrastructure, not as much the pipes or the roads, but rather the buildings that can take place. And so Finney definitely thinks about community services buildings, and we've shown some examples here under buildings are 1 and 2 of what those community buildings could be where Finney sees itself involved. It could be a new recreation facility, a school, an administration building, a health center, child and family services. So for the building that's happening above the land, Finney envisions itself being involved in supporting communities to develop those kinds of community infrastructure. Again, not just the pipes or the roads, but also buildings that are to serve those needs of the community. Okay, over to the right there, we see some buildings that are shown in a gray color. We just want to spend a moment on those. First off, member housing. Finney absolutely recognizes the critical importance of member housing in communities and is there to support the infrastructure that's needed to build member housing. In other words, the water systems, the sanitary sewer systems, the roads to support the member housing, but not Finney not being involved in member housing itself. There certainly are many agencies, whether it be Indigenous Services Canada, whether it be CMA, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or other programs that are there for the actual support of the building the housing. Finney's there for the infrastructure to support it, but not the buildings themselves. And then finally, we'll see industrial, commercial, or market housing happening on many nations' lands. That could be on leased land that the community has decided to lease, or it could be on certificate of possession lands held by individual nation members that they have chosen to lease out. So again, Finney does not envision itself being involved in the actual buildings, the industrial building, the commercial building, or the market housing building, but definitely the infrastructure to support that. In other words, the water systems to provide the water to supplies there, the roads to get to it, and so forth. So that provides hopefully a bit of a picture around how Finney envisions itself being involved in supporting infrastructure projects and the kind of infrastructure where we will become involved. So with that, if I may, Jason, I'd like to turn it back to you to talk a little bit about the Finney process.
Thanks so much, John, for that practical example of community planning. I find the practical examples so helpful in thinking through some of these ideas that can be a bit abstract. So that was very helpful. And I think about, how does community planning fit into the sort of life cycle of an infrastructure project? And this slide, I know it's a bit busy, but it really thinks through an infrastructure project's life cycle, starting at the top row, which is the project identification phase, which I think community planning plays a fundamental role there in scoping out. I know oftentimes, John, when we're having these conversations with communities, right, which we are having a bunch of conversations with communities, it's sort of like, okay, what lands are we, even that question of what lands are we talking about? Because oftentimes we're hearing nations are adding lands to reserve, or they have multiple reserves, or so what lands are we actually talking about? That's the sort of identification phase, which sounds simple sometimes, or even within that particular reserve, maybe it's so large that there's actually two systems. So which lands within the reserve? So again, I just point out that this project identification phase, which when you read it on the page here, seems like it should be simple. It's not always that simple. And so that community planning seems to be, to me, such an important part. And then leading into the business case, part of which is, the strategic case, aligning it with community priorities. But the business case is there's 5 different parts to it. And we're fortunate today to be joined by Jason Reeves, another member of the Finney technical team. And he's done a lot of research with the team on what are the best practices with respect to a business case. And I wonder if I might ask Jason to say a little bit here about what the business case phase is and how community planning fits in there.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone. I'm Jason Reeves. I'm also a member of the Finney technical team, and within that world, sort of known as the other Jason, but I'll do a little bit here on how Finney looks at a business case. So really, we use the 5-case model, which is the international standard for business cases for infrastructure projects. And the reason that we do that is it's really a best practice-based planning and decision-making tool for the project. This is what Jason was saying. So really, if the process, the exercise of going through and completing really a robust business case goes a long way in helping to develop that sort of comprehensive risk management framework, ensuring, that the project's going to be sustainable over its life. It's going to be fit for purpose. It's going to last as long as it's intended. So that's why we go through this, and the 5 cases I'll just run through somewhat briefly. As John was describing all of the planning and the necessary components there, Jason linked that really nicely with how that informs the strategic case, which really just provides that compelling rationale for the project, ensuring that there's strategic fit, ensuring that the nation's community objectives, its vision, its overall strategy, this project is well aligned with that and will feed in and contribute to that. That's the point of the strategic case. The second part is the technical case. The feasibility study is really the central piece of the technical case. This is where all the different technical solutions or technical options to address those challenges that were identified in the strategic case, that's where they're identified here. And, this is essentially the long list of options that achieve sort of those project objectives defined in the strategic case. There should probably be a list of critical success factors for the project, and then an evaluation of these long list options against that list of, success factors. And so what are we looking at when we say sort of this initial evaluation? How do we get to a short list? Looking at performance requirements or level of service. There's site selection, footprint, delivery timelines, what are the environmental impacts that could occur, social aspects, public health things, and a key one, not to say that the others aren't important, but also financial implications. Then we go to get to that short list and then a more detailed evaluation to end up at, what the preferred option would be. And then we're looking in this business case for descriptions of constructability, operability, maintainability. How are we going to ensure service continuity from whatever existing infrastructure or service there is into what the new situation will be? Resiliency in light of climate change events, community impacts, that sort of thing. The next one, as illustrated on the slide, is the commercial case. So really this one starts with a project summary. What are we talking about? What have we arrived at from the first 2 cases so far? There's a description of the scope, scale, complexity, and desired timelines. These are the high level things that we're looking at. In addition, cost estimates and what are the potential funding sources and revenue streams. So now that we have that project summary in mind, we do sort of an internal assessment. That's what we're looking for in the commercial case. Has the team's capacities to deliver on this project being looked at? And with that, we are going to have, there will be another Finny webinar that gets into procurement models and how different ones accomplish different things. But that's what we're looking at in the commercial case. What are the procurement requirements imposed by funders, or what's the owner's own procurement processes, and how do the different models achieve more so or less so each of those types of requirements? And again, there's an evaluation process that takes place. Is each of the models, is it viable based on the project summary and internal readiness assessment that we've said? Is it capable of meeting those requirements? And if there was a market sounding exercise, is the model that we're looking at, consistent with that feedback? Those are shortlisted. There can be a qualitative evaluation using a scoring system to get to the one that we're looking at, and then even a quantitative evaluation where there's some financial analysis that informs a decision. And through all that process of the commercial case, we arrive at what the preferred project delivery model is. The next one in the business case is the financial case. So this one's quite key, the one that I often focus on myself, but the financial model is the central piece here of the financial case, the whole of life financial model that considers all the types of costs over the project's entire life cycle. Like, have we considered capital costs? Have we considered operations and maintenance costs, and those larger periodic asset rehabilitation costs? Has each of the different groups that will receive service from the infrastructure project been identified, and have the costs that have been identified, have they been fairly and equitably allocated amongst those different groups, according to some defined methodology. In terms of the capital costs, have we looked at all the financing options? Has there been an evaluation, and have we identified, what the preferred financing terms will be? In terms of those asset rehabilitation costs, is there requirements to establish reserve funds so that, we're going to have those financial resources in place at the time when they're needed to take on those costs? So again, there will be another webinar Finney will put out for this next piece, which is looking at the revenues. Are there cost recovery tools when we're thinking about the portion of those costs that serve economic development? Have we thought about and evaluated and selected different mechanisms that are going to be appropriate to recover those costs over time? Have the financial risks all been identified with some contingency strategies? And that financial case ends with basically it just demonstrates that there's a confirmation that the financial model is going to be sustainable for this project. And lastly, the management case. So this is the part of the business case where we are looking to see how the team is established that's going to actually deliver the project. There's capacities that are going to be needed to successfully deliver the project, and there should be an assessment of what the nation has in place now and some strategies to fill any gaps in those capacities. The project governance will be hopefully very clearly described in the management case. We're talking decision-making process, description of roles and responsibilities, critical reporting lines, perhaps even illustrated. The project plan should be laid out. There should be timelines with key milestones and critical path analysis. Hopefully there's a risk management strategies that are described here where risks are identified and there's some analysis and management with, transferring it to mitigating it, accepting it, etc. And an engagement plan. There should be hopefully seen in the management case as well. Identification of those groups and parties and entities with whom we need to engage, strategies, and a communications plan, perhaps even some monitoring as we go along too, to make sure that we're staying on track. And then, so the last piece of it there is sort of highlighted orange. It says business case, and we've done that just with this view of, so Finney has established these draft standards at this point in time around a business case, and they will be published in the future. And soon Finney will be able to, upon request, review a business case at the request of a First Nation and issue a certificate that says, hey, this business case achieves these published standards. And that's a pretty reliable signal that's going to let others know that all of this planning work that's being described, it has been done and thought about, and there's management strategies to address each of these risks. So that's several minutes on the business case. I'll throw it back to Jason now. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Jason. And yeah, it definitely, I think your point at the end there is well made, that, developing a good business case is really going to instill confidence in your members that you've done the work required to make sure your project's going to be successful. Funders, lenders, even contractors that are going to bid on your project. You may have more contractors coming forward, putting their best foot forward, and having some competition in price. So all good things, reasons to develop a business case. Finney's really there to support nations throughout all of that work as well, to optimize your business case. And once you have it ready, and then you're in a place to go through to procurement, which is the third row of this table, which is really reaching out to find a firm to build your project with you and do it in a way that you've described so well in your business case. And so Finney's there to support with documentation, with the competitive process and reviewing bids, and then finally implementation and operations, which we know is an important phase, longer phase, which than shown really on here. Hopefully your assets can last a long time, and Finney's there to support throughout that as well. So thanks for bearing with us through this webinar. We're just getting close to the end here. Just before we wrap up, I think it's maybe helpful just to revisit what Finney is and how Finney can support you. I know we've mentioned this a few times throughout, and we have this handy table here just to sum it up. Finney's an Indigenous-led institute to support First Nations and Indigenous organizations to develop projects on time and on budget. It's all about capacity development, providing technical support, advisory services, complementary to the other existing fiscal institutions under the FMA, and supporting due diligence on monies invested in infrastructure. And just as sometimes it's helpful to clarify as well what Finney's not. Finney's not a funding body, not an engineering or architectural firm, not a contractor or an operator, and definitely not an owner or a decision maker. Certainly not replacing any of the other groups or stakeholders that we'll be in. But again, it's all about Finney supporting capacity development, optimizing project plans like Jason just described to you, instilling confidence in your membership, funders, lenders, and contractors that this project's ready to go. So just want to say again, thanks for joining us today. We hope this webinar has provided you with valuable insights, practical tools for community planning and infrastructure development. If you have further questions or need additional resources, please visit our website at www.finney.ca, fnii.ca. You can also listen to interviews with Finney technical staff and clients on our podcast page. And you can also access tools, especially about some really good stuff there about the business case on our resources page. Or you can even reach out directly to us at info@finney.ca. So thanks again for joining us. We hope to talk to you soon.